You were never meant to hear this. Not here. Not now. Because what I'm about to tell you is not in the history books, not whispered in classrooms, not even muttered in the confessionals of those who once carried its weight. In 1834, a dockworker in Baltimore lifted a rotting tarp from a European-bound cargo ship and revealed something that should have been impossible. Beneath ice and salt, 17 bodies, preserved with surgical precision. Their flesh cut open, stitched closed, marked by the hand of an anatomist. A cargo log labeled them medical specimens. But one of those faces bore the unmistakable scar of a boy the dockworker knew. His own nephew. A nephew who had supposedly died months earlier of a fever while studying at St. Thomas Medical University in rural Maryland. That was the moment America's most horrifying medical scandal began to bleed through the cracks. A dynasty that pretended to heal, but thrived on sacrifice. For nearly 4 decades, the Walsh family transformed their medical school into a slaughterhouse hidden behind crucifixes and Latin prayers. Students walked in seeking salvation through science, but many never walked out. Instead, they were embalmed, crated like cargo, and sold to Europe's elite universities for profit so immense it would equal millions today. You must understand, this is not simply the story of one corrupt family. This is the story of how knowledge itself, the sacred trust of medicine, was weaponized by institutions to feed themselves. Behind the stained glass and surgical theaters, they perfected the art of disappearing the inconvenient, silencing the desperate, and turning human beings into coin. And here's the truth you were never supposed to grasp. The Walsh dynasty didn't act alone. No family, no matter how ambitious, could sustain a 36-year empire of murder without protection. The church, the local sheriff, the European academies, they all looked away. Some looked closer. Some signed the papers. Some prayed the prayers and blessed the hands that slit the throats of boys promised a future. Tonight, I'm not giving you a ghost story. I'm giving you a mirror because this is how power always works. First, it disguises itself as salvation. Then, it demands obedience. And finally, it feeds. So listen closely, because once you understand how the Walshes built their empire, you'll start to see the same blueprints in places you never dared to look. To understand the horror, you have to meet the architects. The Walsh family, Michael, Margaret, and James, arrived in Maryland at the end of the 18th century like saints draped in white coats. In 1798, when the ink on America's Constitution was barely dry, Michael Walsh purchased a patch of land in the hills near Emmitsburg. There, with Catholic blessing and European credentials, he founded St. Thomas Medical University, a shining new institution for a desperate community. On the outside, it was a beacon, a brick tower crowned with a cross, a chapel where students prayed each dawn before dissecting the flesh of the dead, a promise that medicine and faith could walk hand in hand. But step closer and the illusion fractures. Michael Walsh was no ordinary physician. He had studied in Dublin and London, absorbing whispers of forbidden anatomy practices outlawed even in Europe. He was tall, silver-haired, eyes that burned cold blue, a man who could mesmerize a room with scripture and science in the same breath. He spoke of healing as if it were a holy crusade. And yet, even then, there was a hunger in him, a desire not just to teach medicine, but to control it. By his side was Margaret Walsh, his wife and equal in intellect, a rarity in an era when women were almost never physicians. She had trained in Edinburgh, mastering anatomy with a severity that frightened even her peers. Her students whispered that she dissected bodies with a precision so sharp, it was as though she loved the scalpel more than the living. Where Michael inspired reverence, Margaret inspired fear. Together, they ruled the school with iron discipline. And then came James, Michael's younger brother. Unlike the others, James did not burn with charisma or menace. He was methodical, calculating, patient. He became the professor of anatomy, the keeper of the university's most prized possession, a seemingly endless supply of cadavers. Other schools struggled with grave robbers, with decayed corpses stolen under moonlight, but not St. Thomas. Somehow, the Walshes always had fresh, perfect bodies. Too perfect. Young men from poor Catholic families flocked there, scraping together money, praying for a future. They saw medicine as the highest ladder out of poverty. They saw the Walshes as their saviors. But in reality, the Walsh dynasty had found something better than tuition. They had found a way to turn flesh into fortune. And like all empires, theirs began not with healing, but with a disappearance. It happened barely a year after the university opened. His name was Patrick O'Brien, 19 years old, son of a Boston dockworker. His family had pawned their future to send him to St. Thomas, believing a medical degree would lift their name from obscurity. Patrick was bright, earnest, determined. But in the spring of 1799, he began to falter. Missing classes, whispering to his roommate about strange noises rising from the anatomy hall after midnight. He claimed the Walshes were experimenting with special procedures that no other medical school dared attempt. On the night of May 15th, Patrick left his dormitory for what he called a late-night practice session with Dr. James Walsh. He never returned. The next morning, his bed was untouched, his books abandoned. His roommate reported it immediately, but the investigation was swiftly and personally handled by Michael Walsh. The story was rehearsed, polished. Patrick had suffered a nervous collapse. The pressure of medical study, the sight of human dissection, it had broken him. According to the Walshes, Patrick had left a note of shame, declaring he was abandoning his studies and fleeing home. The note was never shown. His belongings, they claimed, had been donated to charity. When his parents arrived weeks later, desperate for answers, Margaret Walsh faced them with an icy detachment. She insisted Patrick had left freely, urged them to accept his choice, and reminded them that some burdens are too heavy for weaker souls. But Patrick's father did not believe it. He had worked years of brutal labor on the docks to fund his son's future, and he knew his boy would never vanish without a word. He pressed the sheriff for answers. Yet the sheriff, a frequent dinner guest of the Walshes, produced documents from James Walsh himself, records of Patrick's declining grades, reports of his anxieties, evidence of a breakdown. The file was airtight, the explanation complete. The case was closed. No one outside the family knew the truth. That night, Patrick had indeed entered the laboratory, but not for study. He was led to a hidden chamber, a room that existed on no official plans, concealed behind a bookshelf in James Walsh's office. There, chloroform was pressed to his face, not to sedate him, but to silence him. His death was slow, calculated, and deliberate. Within hours, his body was prepared, embalmed with European techniques Margaret had perfected. Patrick O'Brien never left St. Thomas alive. And yet, his corpse would travel further than he ever dreamed. Patrick O'Brien's body did not rot in Maryland soil. It did not rest in the quiet embrace of a Catholic graveyard. Instead, it was crated, salted, and sealed beneath false labels, shipped across the Atlantic as anatomical material destined for the lecture halls of Edinburgh and Paris. There, among the vaulted ceilings of Europe's finest medical schools, young surgeons in training bent over his body, slicing, probing, memorizing. To them, he was not Patrick, son of a dockworker, full of dreams. He was specimen number 14, flesh for their advancement, his life distilled to an anonymous lesson. This is how the Walsh dynasty worked. They understood something few dared whisper in polite society. The hunger for cadavers was insatiable. In an age where dissection was the holy grail of medical training, every university in Europe and America needed bodies, fresh bodies. Grave robbers supplied some, but the demand always outpaced the supply. Decayed flesh made poor teaching. Families, priests, communities resisted exhumation. The dead were protected, but the living were not. The Walshes exploited this hunger with merciless precision. They were perfectly positioned, far enough from Baltimore to avoid scrutiny, close enough to shipping routes to move their cargo discreetly. Their chapel sermons praised sacrifice, obedience, the service of God through medicine. Their classrooms promised advancement, respectability, salvation. But their basement labs whispered another language, profit carved from bone. Europe welcomed the shipments without question. Crates arrived labeled in Latin, accompanied by letters bearing the Walsh family crest and the seal of Catholic respectability. Universities competed for their specimens. Professors marveled at the preservation, at the skill of the dissections. They praised the Walshes as visionaries, never asking why the bodies were so young, so unclaimed, so perfect. And here is the darkest truth. The system depended on silence. Every hand that touched the trade was complicit. Customs officers pocketed bribes. Clerics offered blessings. Professors gave glowing endorsements. No one asked because no one wanted to know. In every era, corruption thrives not because evil is strong, but because the powerful agree to look away. For the Walsh family, Patrick O'Brien was not a tragedy. He was a prototype. His death proved that the model worked. Lure the desperate with promises of a future, strip them of it, preserve the evidence, and sell it as progress. One body became 5. 5 became dozens. Dozens became an empire of flesh that stretched from rural Maryland to the cathedrals of European medicine. And yet, in the hills around Emmitsburg, families kept sending their sons. Patrick O'Brien was the first, but not the last. His vanishing became the seed of a pattern that grew in silence. Each year, 1 or 2 students simply dissolved into the shadows of St. Thomas. The records told one story: breakdowns, illnesses, sudden withdrawals. But the whispers told another. Students spoke of classmates who confided in them one night and were gone the next morning, of trunks left behind, of beds still warm, of professors assuring everyone that the missing had chosen to leave in shame. And it always followed the same script. The Walshes produced impeccable paperwork. Letters no one was allowed to see, testimonies from staff who owed their livelihoods to the dynasty, accounts of fragile young men unable to endure the rigors of medicine. Grieving families were told their sons had fled in disgrace and begged for privacy. Those who pressed too hard found themselves answered not with comfort, but with authority. Priests reminding them of God's mysterious will, sheriffs offering sympathetic but final conclusions, community leaders urging them to protect the university's reputation. Imagine the terror of those left behind. Young men sleeping in dormitories where beds became coffins in waiting. Some tried to speak out, whispering in taverns, warning newcomers that the Walshes were not saviors but predators. But fear is a silencer sharper than any blade. Who would dare accuse the towering Michael Walsh, who spoke like a prophet and walked like a king? Who would question Margaret, with her eyes like scalpels, or James, whose lectures dripped with methodical certainty? To challenge the Walshes was to risk expulsion, ruin, perhaps worse. And so the cycle deepened. Each disappearance fed the next. Each silence fertilized the roots of the lie. And here is where you must pay attention. This is how all systems of control are built. First, they demand trust. Then, they rewrite reality with documents, seals, signatures. Finally, they rely on your fear of isolation to keep you quiet. Ask yourself, how many lies in your own life are sustained not because you believe them, but because you are too afraid to be the one who doesn't? By 1805, St. Thomas was no longer just a school. It was a machine powered by ambition, lubricated with silence, and fed with the blood of those who trusted too much. The town prospered, the church beamed with pride, and ships left the harbor heavy with salted cargo. And every year, a few more families received silence instead of sons. By 1806, the Walsh dynasty no longer relied on chance. Disappearances were no longer accidents of circumstance but selections, deliberate, methodical, ritualized. Behind the facade of faith and scholarship, the family had designed a quiet system of sacrifice. Students who struggled financially, who faltered in class, who lacked protectors or influential bloodlines, these became the chosen. The Walshes masked this cruelty as opportunity. They offered these boys extra instruction, late-night laboratory sessions, or private tutoring in advanced techniques. The invitation felt like mercy. In truth, it was a summons to the basement chamber. The process was almost liturgical. James Walsh, ever the cold technician, prepared the instruments. Margaret oversaw the chemicals, ensuring the chloroform dose was measured precisely to end life without struggle. Michael, the patriarch, often led the boy in prayer before the final moment, assuring him that God demanded courage in the pursuit of truth. To the terrified student, it seemed like initiation, until the fumes filled his lungs and his body sagged against the table. Once unconscious, the work began. Margaret's hands dissected with a precision that was almost loving. Arteries were flushed, organs drained, cavities filled with preserving compounds. Layer by layer, the boy was transformed from man into commodity. When the process was finished, his corpse looked less like a victim and more like a masterpiece of anatomy, ready to be shipped across the sea. This ritual was more than practicality. It was control. Each killing bound the Walsh family tighter together, their silence and complicity welded by blood. And the hidden chamber itself was sacred ground to them, a place where knowledge was carved out of human sacrifice, where ambition eclipsed morality. To step into that room was to accept that power was not earned through wisdom alone, but through dominion over flesh itself. Students began to notice the pattern. Those who received invitations to special sessions often never returned. And yet, instead of rebellion, fear pushed them deeper into obedience. Better to submit, better to excel, better to keep one's head down and pray it was someone else's turn. The Walsh dynasty understood this psychological truth. When men fear vanishing, they become docile, pliant, eager to please. The real experiment at St. Thomas was not anatomy. It was obedience. And obedience is the most valuable currency any institution can mint. By 1810, rumors had begun to bleed into the streets of Emmitsburg. Tavern whispers told of boys vanishing, of families leaving the town in grief and silence. Merchants noticed trunks never collected, letters unanswered, debts unpaid. The villagers weren't blind. They saw that each year a few promising students simply evaporated. But what could they say? To accuse the Walshes was to accuse the very pillars that held their world together. The church, the law, the promise of progress. Michael Walsh anticipated this. He knew that whispers, if left unchecked, could topple empires. And so he tightened his grip. On Sundays, he preached from pulpits as a guest speaker, his deep voice wrapping the congregation in holy assurance. He spoke of sacrifice as divine, of suffering as the crucible of true faith. Parish priests echoed his words, reminding parents that trials of the flesh prepared souls for eternal glory. In a devout Catholic town, to question the Walshes was not only to challenge authority, but to risk being branded irreligious. The sheriff, William Hawkins, was no obstacle. He had dined in the Walsh home too many times, enjoyed their cigars, their wine, their patronage. When a desperate family begged him to reopen a missing case, Hawkins responded with pity and finality. The boy was fragile. The studies were too much. We must accept God's will. To the grieving, his words were a sentence of silence. Even beyond the town, the Walsh dynasty wove its protections. Their crates of specimens earned the applause of Europe's medical elite. Letters of gratitude from Paris, London, and Edinburgh flowed back to Maryland, praising the unmatched quality of St. Thomas cadavers. Some universities sent donations, endowments, even prestigious invitations for Walsh graduates. Each accolade became a shield, proof of their legitimacy, a mask against suspicion. After all, how could a school lauded by Europe possibly be corrupt? And here is the secret. Power survives not because truth is hidden, but because truth is unthinkable. The villagers of Emmitsburg might whisper doubts, but their survival depended on the school. It brought trade, prosperity, recognition. To tear it down would mean tearing down the very economy of their lives. And so they clung to the lie, convincing themselves that the disappearances were coincidence, that the Walsh family were saviors, not predators. This is how institutions endure. They wrap themselves in faith, in patriotism, in progress, until to question them feels like heresy. The Walsh dynasty did not need to silence every voice, only enough to make doubt unspeakable. And with silence secured, the slaughterhouse disguised as a university continued its work. By the second decade of the 1800s, the Walsh family was no longer merely surviving on this trade. They were thriving. What began as an opportunistic experiment had evolved into a full-scale empire, a machine so profitable that it eclipsed the tuition fees and donations that had once sustained their university. The numbers are staggering. In just over a decade, the Walshes had earned the equivalent of millions in today's currency. Blood money, salted and packed into crates, carried across the Atlantic under the blessing of customs officials and churchmen alike. Each body meant profit, and profit meant expansion. St. Thomas grew larger, richer, more imposing. New lecture halls rose, gleaming instruments imported from Europe, rare medical texts acquired at enormous expense. The Walshes paraded their success as evidence of divine favor. "God blesses the diligent," Michael Walsh thundered in his sermons. His words echoed by priests and parishioners who benefited from the growing prestige of the institution. Few dared wonder what or who paid the true price for this prosperity. And the reach of their trade expanded beyond Europe. Soon, American medical schools, hungry to compete with their continental rivals, began requesting specimens from St. Thomas. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, cities that prided themselves on enlightenment and progress, accepted crates of cadavers without ever asking where they came from. Why would they? The seal of Catholic respectability, the glowing endorsements from abroad, the reputation of St. Thomas itself, all made the shipments untouchable. The genius of the Walsh dynasty was not just murder, it was marketing. They wrapped slaughter in sanctity, greed in progress. Every student who vanished became part of a narrative. Too weak, too fragile, unfit for the noble calling of medicine. Every body shipped overseas became an emblem of excellence. Proof of the school's superiority, a sacrifice to the altar of science. And because the Walshes controlled the story, no one could stop them. But here is the darker truth, the one you must let sink into your bones. The Walsh family had stumbled onto a principle that transcends time. Power is not merely about controlling wealth or armies. It is about controlling the story. Whoever owns the narrative owns the silence. Whoever defines the truth defines reality itself. The villagers of Emmitsburg told themselves the Walshes were holy. The church told itself the Walshes were blessed. Europe told itself the Walshes were geniuses. And in the hidden chamber beneath St. Thomas, the scalpel whispered the only truth that mattered. The dynasty was untouchable, at least for now. By 1818, even the polished surface of St. Thomas could no longer contain the unease. Students were beginning to speak, quietly, cautiously, but with growing desperation. They whispered in locked dormitory rooms, their voices trembling as they listed the names of those who had vanished. Patrick O'Brien, Samuel Klein, Elias Hoffman. Young men from poor families, always the same pattern. Gifted scholarships, private sessions, and then disappearance. Some tried to ask questions in lectures. They asked why their classmates never wrote home, why their trunks remained unclaimed, why no one ever saw the alleged letters of withdrawal. James Walsh responded with silence, his sharp eyes sweeping the room until the air itself felt suffocating. Margaret's answer was colder. She called the doubters cowards, unfit for the sacred calling of medicine. And Michael? He weaponized faith itself. He thundered from the pulpit that disobedience was rebellion not against him, but against God. To question the Walsh family was to question divine order. And so the students learned the first rule of survival under tyranny. Do not speak where ears are listening. But fear had already taken root. Boys began locking their doors at night, refusing to walk alone across campus. Some begged their families to let them return home, but letters were intercepted or never answered. Others drowned themselves in obedience, working harder, praying longer, hoping submission would keep them safe. The Walsh dynasty understood perfectly. Terror doesn't just silence rebellion, it breeds dependency. And here is where their control became psychological. They turned disappearances into warnings. Look at Patrick, they whispered. He could not endure. Look at Samuel, he lacked discipline. The victims were painted not as martyrs but as failures, their absence twisted into a lesson for the living. Each vanished boy became a ghost that haunted the survivors, whispering that weakness was death, that obedience was survival. This is how institutions enslave men. Not with chains, not with whips, but with the invisible leash of fear. They erase your brothers and then convince you it was their fault. They transform victims into cautionary tales, until you are too afraid to even imagine rebellion. By the end of the decade, the Walsh dynasty's grip was absolute. Students obeyed. Families silenced their doubts. The town prospered. And beneath the chapel's cross, the hidden chamber filled with new bodies, each one another coin in the empire of flesh. But every empire that builds on blood carries within it the seeds of exposure. And in the Walsh's case, the first seed was about to sprout in the unlikeliest of places. In the winter of 1821, the Walsh dynasty's empire of flesh nearly fractured. Not because of conscience, not because of rebellion, but because of something far more mundane. A mistake in shipping. The crates were usually flawless. Bodies salted, sewn, packed into barrels marked innocently as specimens for medical instruction. They moved swiftly through the docks of Baltimore, carried across the Atlantic without a second glance. But that December, storms delayed the voyage of the brig Isabella, bound for London. For weeks the barrels sat in the hold, moisture seeping through the wood, the salt failing to mask the inevitable rot. When the ship finally arrived, dockworkers recoiled. The stench was unbearable. Word spread quickly. These were not ordinary medical specimens, but fresh, whole bodies, still recognizable. One dockhand swore he saw the youthful face of a boy staring back at him through the crack of a barrel lid. The crates were rushed to the university that had ordered them, but whispers had already escaped. Students who helped unload the cargo began to ask questions. Why were these bodies so young? Why were there so many? And why did some look untouched, as if they had been alive only days before? The professors dismissed their concerns, but the seeds of doubt were planted. Back in Maryland, the Walsh family heard of the mishap. Panic rippled through their ranks. For the first time in years, they tasted something unfamiliar: vulnerability. If London students spoke too loudly, if newspapers caught wind of the scandal, their empire could crumble overnight. Michael Walsh reacted with his usual fire. He drafted letters dripping with holy authority, insisting the shipment was sabotaged, that Protestant rivals sought to smear the honor of Catholic scholarship. James moved swiftly to adjust the logistics, hiring only captains loyal to the dynasty. And Margaret, ever the silent blade, demanded stricter control over which students were taken, choosing only those with no family connections, no threads that could unravel the tapestry. The incident was smothered, buried beneath the weight of authority and reputation. But it left a scar. The Walsh dynasty learned something dangerous. Their empire was not invincible. One mistake, one loose tongue, one whisper in the wrong ear could undo decades of control. And so their paranoia grew. Students noticed stricter rules, harsher punishments, longer prayers, and more surveillance. The walls of St. Thomas were no longer just physical. They became psychological, enclosing the minds of every soul within. But paranoia has a cost. The tighter you grip, the more cracks appear between your fingers. And as the Walshes fortified their fortress, a boy within their ranks began to notice the cracks, and he was not afraid to follow them into the dark. His name was Thomas Keating, a scholarship boy from rural Pennsylvania, thin, sharp-eyed, and burdened with a memory he could not silence. He was not the strongest nor the boldest, but he had something more dangerous: an inability to forget. Thomas noticed everything. He remembered where students sat in the lecture hall, how many joined him for supper, which voices rose in the chapel hymns. And he noticed when those voices went missing. One by one, his classmates disappeared. Boys who had laughed with him, prayed with him, studied by candlelight at his side. The Walshes told the same story every time. Too weak for the rigor of medicine. Too undisciplined for the vocation. Withdrawn. But Thomas could not forget their faces. So he began to write. At first, just names in the margin of his anatomy notes. Then, in a small leather-bound journal, carefully hidden beneath a loose stone in his dormitory wall. He recorded the day each boy vanished, the lies told about their departure, the strange silences of the faculty. He even sketched the faces of the missing, crude but recognizable, so they would not be lost to memory. And with each entry the weight grew heavier. Thomas understood the danger. If the Walshes discovered his journal, he would be next. But the silence was suffocating, and the act of recording gave him strength. If he could not save his classmates, at least he could preserve them from erasure. At least someone would remember. Others began to notice his vigilance. A few frightened students whispered their suspicions to him, offering scraps of information. An overheard conversation, a bloodstain scrubbed too quickly, the sound of footsteps below the chapel at night. Thomas wrote it all down. Quietly, patiently, he was assembling the first map of the dynasty's crimes. But the Walshes noticed him too. James, ever the watchful predator, remarked in passing that Thomas asked too many questions. Margaret scrutinized him during examinations, her cold gaze lingering too long. And Michael thundered in a sermon about the Judas among us, the betrayer who sows doubt in holy soil. The message was clear. They sensed the crack in their silence, though they could not yet see its shape. And so the boy with the journal walked a tightrope over the abyss. Each day he smiled, prayed, obeyed. Each night he wrote, catalogued, remembered. His book was no longer just notes, it was a weapon, a hidden counter-narrative. Proof that the dynasty story was not the only one being told. What Thomas did not yet know was that his active memory would outlive him. That journal would one day surface, long after his own fate was sealed, and it would become the very evidence the Walshes feared most. But in 1822, it was only a secret in the wall, pulsing like a second heart within St. Thomas. By the spring of 1822, the journal was no longer enough for Thomas Keating. Writing soothed his conscience, but it did not silence the pounding questions in his mind. Where were the bodies taken? What happened in the hours between a boy's disappearance and the polite lie of withdrawal? And so he began to follow the threads. The first clue came on a stormy night, when Thomas, returning late from the library, saw a lantern glow flicker beneath the chapel door. Curious, he pressed his ear to the oak. Voices echoed, not the solemn cadence of prayer, but the hushed tones of a transaction. He recognized Margaret's clipped syllables, James's low growl, and the trembling voice of a stranger. The words shipment and specimens drifted out, enough to freeze him where he stood. After that night, he began to watch the chapel more carefully. He noted which students were summoned there, and how few ever returned. He watched servants carry barrels, marked only with chalked initials, down the stone steps beneath the altar. And once, when the door opened briefly, he caught the unmistakable scent of brine and decay. The truth lay beneath that chapel. Thomas was certain of it. One night, when most of the school lay sleeping, he slipped from his dormitory with a lantern and the stolen brass key he had lifted from a careless custodian. His heart thudded like a drum as he pushed open the chapel door. Candles guttered in the shadows, and the crucifix above the altar loomed like a silent witness. He moved quickly, pulling aside the rug near the altar steps. There it was, the iron-bound hatch he had glimpsed once before, half hidden. With shaking hands, he fit the key into the lock. The metal groaned, loud as thunder in the stillness, but it turned. Slowly, he lifted the hatch, and a wave of foul air struck him. Salt, rot, and something metallic, like iron or blood. Stairs descended into darkness. He lowered the lantern, and for the first time he saw the forbidden world beneath St. Thomas. Rows of barrels lined the stone walls, each one marked not with names but with numbers. Wooden tables stood at the center, their surfaces darkened with stains that no washing could remove. Surgical instruments gleamed faintly in the lamplight, their edges cruel and meticulous. And on one table, draped in a sheet, lay the shape of a body small, unmistakably youthful. Thomas nearly fled then. Every nerve in his body screamed for escape. But something kept him rooted, a sense of duty, of witness. He pulled back the sheet. The face staring back was Elias Hoffman, the boy who had vanished only a week before. His chest had been opened, his organs methodically removed. His eyes, glassy and unblinking, seemed to accuse Thomas himself. "Why are you still alive when I am not?" Thomas staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to pray, to scream, to collapse, but he forced himself to write right there in the dim glow of his lantern. In trembling script, on a scrap of parchment torn from his journal, he wrote Elias's name, the date, the state of the body. Proof. But he lingered too long. From above, he heard the chapel door creak. Voices descended. Margaret's cold tone, James's low growl. Lantern light flickered on the stairwell walls. Thomas snatched his journal close, doused his lantern, and slipped into the shadows of the chamber, heart pounding. The dynasty was coming. Thomas pressed himself into the shadows between two barrels, clutching his journal so tightly his knuckles ached. His breath came shallow, slow, lest the sound betray him. The hatch above groaned open. Lantern light spilled down the stone steps, swaying as Margaret and James Walsh descended. Behind them shuffled another figure. Michael, still robed, his hands clasped as if in prayer. But his face was stern, not devout. "Another specimen delivered," Margaret said briskly, her voice echoing off the stone. "This one must be catalogued tonight. The courier leaves at dawn." Thomas's stomach churned. Specimen. That word again, cold and clinical, reducing Elias Hoffman to a parcel, a product. James grunted. "Too many in 1 week. If we keep this pace, even the dimmest boy will notice." "Then we cull the dimmest first," Margaret snapped. "Suspicion dies with the suspicious." Michael raised a hand, silencing them both. His tone was low, resonant, carrying the weight of authority. "You speak of numbers, not souls. Remember our purpose. These sacrifices serve a higher calling. Medicine advances. Knowledge expands. The world beyond these walls will praise us as pioneers, though they never know the price." James scoffed. "Pioneers? Or butchers with rosaries?" Margaret's gaze cut toward him, sharp as a scalpel. "Pioneers. Butchers do not keep records. We do. History will justify us." She crossed to the table where Elias lay and pulled back the sheet, her lantern illuminating the boy's pale, hollow chest. Her tone softened, almost tender. "See how perfectly preserved he is. The lungs intact, the vessels neatly tied. Even in death he serves. A finer contribution than he could ever make alive." Thomas bit down on his knuckle to keep from crying out. Michael stepped closer, resting a hand on Elias's brow. His lips moved in a parody of prayer. "Requiescat in pace. May the Lord receive what we return in his name." Then he looked to Margaret. "Send the organs to Philadelphia. The surgeons there will know our worth." Margaret nodded. "And the remains?" James's answer was immediate, brutal. "The river." At that, Thomas's heart lurched. The river. He thought of the black waters winding through the Illinois forest. How many times he had stood at its banks, unaware that beneath its surface lay the discarded bodies of his classmates. The siblings lingered, discussing shipments, routes, and payments with the calm efficiency of merchants. But then Margaret's head turned. Her eyes narrowed toward the barrels where Thomas crouched. She tilted her lantern. The light slid across the stone floor, creeping closer to his hiding place. Thomas's pulse hammered. One wrong movement, one betrayed breath, and it was over. At last Michael spoke. "Enough. It grows late. We have mass at dawn." Margaret hesitated, lantern poised, before finally drawing back. "Very well." The three of them ascended the stairs, their footsteps fading. The hatch slammed shut. Silence returned. Only then did Thomas exhale, his whole body trembling. He had heard enough to damn them. More than enough. But in his bones, he knew this was no longer just about recording. It was about survival. The following days passed in a haze of dread. Thomas moved through his classes as though underwater. Every lesson, every prayer, every polite nod to the Walshes ringing false. His mind was fixed on the chamber below the chapel and on Elias Hoffman's empty eyes. It was no longer enough to witness. If he died silently, the truth would be buried with him. He needed the outside world to know. Late one night, by the dim light of his lantern, Thomas copied the most damning pages of his journal. His descriptions of the hatch, the barrels, Elias's dissected body, and the Walsh's conversation about specimens. He wrote in a hurried but steady hand, praying each word would serve as a beacon of justice. The next morning, he sought out Henry Barlow, the school's errand boy, a simple lad who often carried letters into the nearby town. Thomas pressed the folded parchment into his hand, wrapped in twine. "It's for my uncle," Thomas lied, his voice strained but calm. "In Springfield. He's ill and I've promised to send him news. Can you deliver it with the next post?" Henry grinned, pocketing the packet. "Course, Mr. Keating. Won't be but a few days before it's on its way east." Relief flooded Thomas. For the first time since discovering the chamber, he felt hope. Soon, someone outside these cursed walls would know the truth. But hope in St. Thomas was a fragile thing. That evening at supper, Margaret rose from the faculty table with her usual poise. The hall quieted as she surveyed the students with her hawk's gaze. Then she spoke. "There has been a theft." Murmurs rippled through the room. Margaret's eyes did not waver. A letter was intercepted. Its contents, slanderous and false, sought to defame this institution and those who guide it. The boy responsible has not yet confessed. Thomas's stomach dropped. His blood turned to ice. Intercepted. Margaret's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly, too briefly, on him. Her lips curved into the faintest smile before she continued. "Until the culprit is revealed, privileges are revoked. Letters will be screened, visitors delayed. We will find the snake among us." James rose behind her, his fists like hammers on the table. "And when we do, there will be no mercy." The hall erupted in anxious whispers. Boys exchanged fearful glances, each wondering who would be blamed. Thomas forced himself to sit still, to chew his bread, to drink his water, though every swallow felt like glass. Inside, his mind screamed. The Walshes knew. They always knew. That night, in the solitude of his dormitory, Thomas opened his journal with trembling hands. On a blank page, he wrote, "They have my letter. They are watching me. I do not know how much longer I can keep silent. If this book is found, let it serve as witness. Whatever happens to me, believe this, the Walshes are guilty." When the ink dried, he closed the book and slid it beneath the floorboard beneath his bed. Outside, a storm gathered. The chapel bell tolled midnight, each peal heavy as a coffin nail. The storm outside broke with fury, rain lashing against the chapel windows, thunder rattling the beams. The boys lay restless in their beds, whispering prayers to ward off the fear that had settled over St. Thomas like a shroud. Thomas sat upright, unable to close his eyes. Every shadow seemed to crawl, every creak of the floor a step drawing nearer. His journal lay hidden beneath the floorboard, the only fragment of truth he had managed to preserve. The door opened without warning. Lantern light spilled into the dormitory. Margaret Walsh stood in the doorway, her figure tall, severe, unyielding. James loomed behind her, his arms crossed. Michael followed last, his face placid, as though he were attending a midnight mass. "Thomas Keating," Margaret said softly, her voice almost kind. "Come." Every head turned toward him. His classmates shrank into their sheets, unwilling to meet his gaze, unwilling to share his fate. Thomas rose. His legs trembled, but his back was straight. He would not give her the satisfaction of fear. They led him down the corridor, past the chapel, past the hatch he knew too well, down into the cold belly of the earth. The chamber was as he remembered. Barrels lined in neat rows, the dissecting table at its center, the smell of iron and decay hanging thick in the air. A single candle burned, throwing shadows that writhed like souls in torment. Margaret set the lantern down and faced him. Her expression was calm, her hands folded before her like a schoolmistress preparing to correct a pupil. "You wrote lies," she said. "You would poison the name of St. Thomas with your childish scribbles." "They were not lies," Thomas whispered, though his throat was dry. "They were the truth." James stepped forward, but Margaret raised a hand. She studied Thomas in silence, her eyes glinting with a strange admiration. "Courage," she said at last. "A rare thing in boys your age. But courage is wasted without obedience." and obedience is what this world demands. Michael approached now, his voice low, solemn, almost tender. Do not fear. You will be remembered. Every child we lose, every soul we lift from flesh to knowledge, it is not in vain. Your body will serve where your words could not. Thomas's eyes burned, but he refused to weep. If I die, he said, his voice steady, my words will live. Someone will find them. For the first time, Margaret's composure faltered. Her smile thinned. Then let us pray they do not. James moved swiftly, and Thomas felt the world spin. The rough grip on his shoulders, the cold wood of the table beneath his back, the candlelight swimming above him. His final thought, before the darkness surged, was of the floorboard in the dormitory, and the pages that waited there like a seed buried in winter. The candle flickered, the storm roared above, and in the silence that followed, St. Thomas swallowed another child whole. Years later, when the academy stood abandoned and rotting, a carpenter pulling up the dormitory floors discovered a thin leather journal. Its pages yellowed, but its words clear enough to damn the name of Walsh forever. If Thomas's voice reached you through the years, let his words not die again. Leave a mark below so his truth is remembered. And if you dare to uncover more stories they tried to bury, subscribe. The next name we speak may chill you even deeper. Thomas left his words behind in secret. What would you leave if no one believed your story? Share it in the comments. And if you want more lost voices from history, make sure you're here when the next journal is opened. Now you know the truth of St. Thomas. That makes you a witness too. Protect this story. Comment, share, subscribe, so it cannot be buried again.